Big LEZ'S League, an all rugby league experience.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Breaking Bread, the show where we break down all the latest happenings in the NRL, from the trending topics to some of the stories that may have gone under the radar. And trust me, there has been a ton of news over in the last week. For those of you who don't know, my name is Isaac Issa. I'm a journalist over at Zero Tackle and do some work over at the ABC as well. Basically, all the stories that we talk about on here are covered by me in my articles over at zerotackle.com.au. So if you're wanting to kind of get a deeper dive into a few of the stories that we discuss on here today, or just keen on keeping up with the latest in the NRL, head over to zerotackle.com.au and you can get an inside scoop and a deep dive into all the latest topics in rugby league. For those of you who have kind of been keeping up with the media over the last, 7 days or so, there's been a ton going on in the NRL and heaps that I've covered myself, as well as other journalists and other media spaces that have covered kind of those big stories. And I'm really keen to kind of get into all of it today. As you may see, it's just myself this week. Big Les is out this week, so I will be steering the ship for this week. So hopefully I can do an all right job at hosting. But we should have Big Les back next week. Getting straight into it, kind of probably, the biggest kind of trending topic in the NRL at the moment is the chaos that's going over at the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. And obviously there's been a lot of talk between, the Lockie Galvin signing, as well as, some talk around Reid Marnie and Toby Sexton potentially leaving immediately or at the end of this year. There's been a lot kind of going on in the NRL, and while they're all noteworthy topics, I'm sure that Big Les has kind of talked about a few of them over in his own solo episodes, and you've read and heard a ton of it in your own kind of media digestions as well. If you are keen to kind of get a deep dive into all those trending topics, head over to my Instagram, IsaacIsa_journalist, or as I said, you can head over to zerotackle.com.au. But the topic that I kind of want to get stuck into, and something that I covered for Zero Tackle just on Monday night, is Matt Burton making his way back into the New South Wales Blues camp, and what that means not only for the Blues, but for Origin and for NRL clubs as well. So for those of you who don't know, Stephen Crichton has been struggling with a couple injuries in his time at the Blues camp. Now, it was reported on Monday evening that, Stephen Crichton wasn't able to overcome a cork injury that he suffered earlier in the day during one of his training sessions, during which he limped off the field, iced up on his left leg. So the star centre and the Bulldogs captain, at the time wasn't looking too likely to be playing in the Origin Series opener tonight, Wednesday night. And so with the current 18th man for the Blues, Campbell Graham, also playing a similar position at centre as Stephen Crichton, the absence of Critter would make room for the Rabbitoh star to make his New South Wales Blues debut, which would then leave the 18th man spot open. Now, the Blues had originally brought in, an Adam Dewey, have a Stefano Ituikamanu, and the like in the reserves for the Blues. But it seems Laurie Daly opted to bring in a Matt Burton, who can obviously cover a ton of positions, whether that be centre, in the halves, potentially a spell at 9 or 13, maybe even a 1. So he can cover basically every position on the field. And, he has, been the 18th man for the Blues before. So it did make sense to kind of bring him in. And to be honest, I'm not too sure why he wasn't brought in originally as the 18th man. While I, totally understand Campbell Graham has been due for his debut, I do think that Campbell Graham is best used either on the centre or wing. Otherwise, probably not worth having in the side and taking away from the South Sydney Rabbitohs, who, desperately need their stars at the moment. Now, obviously that's paid dividends for him this time. He is going to get his New South Wales Blues debut if Stephen Crichton isn't fit. And then that makes room for, Winston Neville basically said that Matt Burton is the greatest 18th man for the Blues of all time, and he's really making a case for it. He's once again coming to this side as the 18th man to provide that coverage if needed. Now, the implementing of Matt Burton into this side is definitely an interesting one. Obviously, Burton has been, one of the leading contributors to, the ladder leading Bulldogs over the last, 3 months of the season. But it has caused some concerns for the availability of 18th men at clubland. Now, for those of you who don't know, the 18th man for both the New South Wales Blues and for the Queensland Maroons are not able to play for their clubs in the lead up to the game. Obviously needing to keep their 18th men fit just in case they come on the field. And so that, sucks for clubs like the Bulldogs, for example, who have lost, essentially their best player over the last couple of seasons in Matt Burton because he has been fulfilling that 18th man role and unfortunately hasn't actually gotten game time during Origin either. But it's a double blow for the Bulldogs this year because, obviously they've got Kurt Mann, who's now the 18th man for the Queensland Maroons, which is an absolute, it's such a testament to his character and his work ethic. But it does suck for the Bulldogs, who are already, desperately seeking troops in their Bulldog side and just, copped a flogging from the Dolphins just last week. And so it's definitely an interesting talking point because, it sparks the conversation of whether, having an 18th man miss out on club footy is, the right choice. Now, obviously, you need, all your players fit, and that's undeniable. But it does cause some issues for these NRL sides who are trying to stay afloat as is during the Origin period. And to have, a star player like a Matt Bird and like a Kurt Mann, even if, the Maroons were to go into the direction of having Tom Dearden as an 18th man or, the star 18th man, even a South Sydney Rabbitohs potentially having Campbell Graham as an 18th man originally, losing these star players just for them to not even play in the Origin, it stings for an NRL club, for their fans, and for the player as well, who's, at this point in the season, is probably wanting to have that rest, but at the same time, this is potentially the most important part of the NRL season. And I say that, because probably that round 11 to round, 17, 18 mark is when teams really start to settle in into what they're about for that season. And I use the Rabbitohs as an example. I believe it was 2023. When the Rabbitohs were leading the competition at this time of the year. And by the end of the season, we're not even in the top 8, which is, frightening for the Bulldogs. Now, obviously, it's not due to, or solely due to Origin, but it is definitely a talking point because, this is the time of the year when things can really unravel for a side. You got a side like the Bulldogs who, obviously, they've only lost 2 games in their 13 matches, 12 matches. However, their last few wins haven't been overly convincing. They've come back from, double-digit deficits in 2 matches and then got flogged 44-8 in the following match. And so it's definitely, it can be potentially like a blow for the Bulldogs who are trying to hold on to this spot at the top of the ladder. So that is definitely something to keep an eye on in the coming years because I do think that it could potentially become a big talking point as sides, beginning to lose their 18th men, their star men to that 18th man role more and more in the coming seasons. And look, as much as it sucks for the Bulldogs, I guess it is kind of a consequence of success in this situation because you've got an 18th man in both states, which is a huge honour for both guys, but at the same time, it does suck. And you'd almost hope that they get into the Origin squad at some point, even though you don't want injuries to your players, but it makes that sort of worth it for them. So definitely something to kind of keep an eye on. Now, in terms of the situation itself, I heard today from yesterday from New South Wales Blues medical staff who do expect Stephen Crichton to be fit, and do expect him to play in tonight's clash. Now, by the time this potty comes out, it may be confirmed whether he is or isn't playing, but they do expect him to be fit, so that would allow Campbell Graham to keep that 18th man role and see Matt Burton probably go back to the Bulldogs. Now, it doesn't overly concern the Dogs for this round because they do have the bye, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on in the coming weeks. I do think that this situation may set some alarm bells off in Laurie Daly's head, because obviously, you have a guy like Matt Burton who can cover all these roles, and it was probably a smart idea to have him there originally, because as we all know, injuries just if injuries are common in NRL clubland, they're tenfold in Origin. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on over the next few weeks, and probably the next couple of years as well. And I do expect that if more clubs are losing their players to this 18th man role and begin struggling during those periods, we may see somewhat of an uproar from the clubs. And so, while there's obviously been a ton going on with the Bulldogs, I thought that was a really interesting talking point. And probably one, my biggest thing on Breaking Bread, and Les would agree, is that, you get your huge stories from all these different parts of media, whether that's Fox, whether it's Bloke in a Bar, Channel 9, you get them everywhere. And so we do like to kind of take a different perspective and have a look at the stories that aren't making as much noise. And that's the great thing about what we do here, and not only just through this potty, but my work over at Zero Tackle or all the other kind of shows that Big Les does. And so it's definitely important to kind of get all that news and get as much of the rugby league world into your system as you can, because it obviously informs you as much as you can. So that's probably one of the bigger talking points leading into Origin this evening. But stay tuned for how that kind of unravels over the next few weeks or so. The next story that I wanted to kind of touch on, somewhat related to the Bulldogs again. Actually, they lost to the Dolphins last week. Now, for those of you who watched last week's episode of Breaking Bread, Les and I were discussing Herbie Farnworth, and he's going to be a talking point again today. So last week we were talking about how Herbie Farnworth was showing interest in potentially playing for the Maroons one week, and I think Les and I both agreed that was essentially ridiculous. Not because he's not talented enough or because he's not deserving of some sort of rep honours, but simply because he's a Pommy and he's not, he hasn't lived in Queensland long enough to really warrant a selection in Slater's side. But I believe maybe he heard a lot of the critics and the doubters who kind of went at him around that. Because there were a lot of kind of media personalities, guys like Darren Lockyer, who came out and basically squashed that straight away. And I think Herbie Farnworth might have heard that because he came out in last week's match and he absolutely smashed it against the Dogs. He continued, I believe it's 6 games now in a row that he scored a try. And while that performance was impressive in itself and showcased the leadership that he's developed over at Redcliffe since joining them from the Broncos, he actually revealed a revelation that no one was really aware of until after the game, that he actually was close to not even playing in the match. Now, Herbie Farnworth came down with a pretty nasty leg infection in the days leading up to the match against the Bulldogs. I believe it was last Thursday evening. And so, he kind of brushed it off as, he was just a little bit crook in his post-match interview. But his coach, Christian Wolf, came out and he said, no, he had a really nasty leg infection. And he was hospitalised leading up to the match and was hospitalised on the day of the match, I believe, in Redcliffe. So he only flew down to Sydney a couple of hours before actually playing in the match. And it's genuinely insane because you think how tough these players are. We saw, I believe it was, and I may be wrong, but I believe it was Kurt Donahue on the weekend who broke his nose mid-game, got it fixed and came back in. There was so many injuries over the weekend, and you see these guys kind of just fix it on the sideline and then come back. And to have a guy who was, hospitalised with a, nasty leg infection, as Farnworth was leading up to the match, to then not only come in but dominate against the ladder leading Bulldogs was, it's a true testament to the character that Farnworth has and the leadership that he's developed since joining Redcliffe. Farnworth came out in a wet weather match and showed no signs of any kind of illness or injury. But in his post-match discuss, he was essentially going to be shut down by Christian Wolf and the Dolphins, and obviously didn't want that. He wanted the opportunity to kind of grab the match with both hands. The Dolphins haven't had the most successful season in their post-Wayne Bennett era. However, to get a win over the ladder leading Dogs, who had only lost one game before that in 11 weeks or whatever it was. It speaks to kind of the level of character that Farnworth has, and the amount of commitment that these guys have to their jersey. And so when we're talking about origin and the passion that these guys have for the the maroon jersey with Queensland, or the sky blue jersey with New South Wales, it was Darren Lockyer last week who basically said that a guy like Farnworth wouldn't have passion for the maroon jersey. And while I agree and Les agreed last week when we discussed it, you got a guy like Farnworth who is not from Redcliffe. He doesn't have any connection or ties to the jersey, and honestly, I don't know if many kind of picked the Dolphins to win against the Bulldogs last Friday. He could have easily kind of strayed away from that match, especially after the comments and the backlash that he got about the whole Origin thing just a few days prior. He could have strayed away from it. But instead, he came out and he absolutely dominated and showed up the Dogs on that edge. And it shows that he's not only one of the best centers in the game, but he's probably one of the best players in the game. Definitely top 2, top 3 in his position, and one of the best leaders in the comp. And that's a really underrated factor of his game. I know, like when you kind of say Herbie Farnworth best leader in the comp, that's what he's talking about, but it's moments like this where you really kind of see the character and the leadership skills of a player, and not to have a go at any players, because all players, like all NRL players, just suit up before a match. They're 10 out of 10 warriors, and they've worked and trained so hard to get to that point. But to go that extra mile, like Farnworth did last week, it shows the kind of character and the leadership skills that he's developed over there for the Dolphins. And are we seeing a potential future skipper for the Dolphins? Are we seeing like the emergence of centers in this competition? Developing those leadership roles, similar to like a Jared Croker back in the day, Stephen Crichton now, and that can be looked at as an overreaction, but the game is really changing, and if we don't kind of acknowledge these small moments when these big things happen, like Stephen Crichton winning Captain of the Year last year, seeing these huge things happen in NRL, if we don't acknowledge these little build-up moments, we'll never kind of prepare ourselves for what's to come. And so I think that the media should be covering this a lot more, because it's a true testament to the work that these players put in and the work that Farnworth put in to just get himself back, flying down to Sydney just a couple of hours before the match, and absolutely dominating against the Bulldogs. So hats off to him. Still don't think you're a Queenslander, but I definitely do think that you are one of the best centres in the competition and one of the best players in the comp. The last story that I kind of wanted to talk about today, and I posted this on my social media. For those of you who don't know, it's Isaac Easter _journalist on Instagram. And I chucked this on and got a few, I had a few people kind of, agreeing with me, and I got a lot of backlash, and some people were kind of 50-50, but it was actually about Sharks fullback Will Kennedy and where he should be playing in 2026. Now, when I say where he should be playing, I don't mean position on the field. I think we all know that he's a fullback. But I do mean what jersey will he be wearing in 2026. Now, for those of you who don't know, Code Sports revealed last week that the Sharks approached Will Kennedy and told the off-contract star that if he were to stay at the club, it would be for just $300,000 a year, which is, with putting it bluntly, it's an absolute undersell for one of the best fullbacks in the game. And, I'm pretty sure Will Kennedy is top 5 in Dally M voting right now, just as Dally M voting goes behind, closed doors. So you've got essentially one of your best players of the season enjoying his best season in the NRL to date, and heavily underselling him. And I don't think that's because the Sharks are being cheap in any way, but they've just got so much money tied to the likes of an Adam Fanua-Blake, a Nico Hines, to a lesser degree, a Braden Trindle and a Britton Nakora. You've got these guys who are on, fairly big wickets, and, they obviously haven't prepared for Will Kennedy to have the season that he's essentially having. So, that has left Will Kennedy kind of, pushed to the sidelines and looking for a new contract. This is most likely going to be his last season, and I have identified a few options for the 28-year-old. And this is kind of where the backlash kind of kicked in from some fan bases more than others. But I outlined a few possible opportunities for him. So one of them is to essentially join the Perth Bears in 2027. I think that he would be an awesome signing for that club, as a franchise player. I think he can follow a similar role as, Hamiso Tabuai-Fidow at the Dolphins a couple of years ago, where he came out and he absolutely killed it. Now, obviously, Will Kennedy is in much better form than Hammer was leading up to his signing, but I do think that, especially with the Perth Bears being across Australia, they're already going to struggle as it is to bring in these marquee players. And I think that Kennedy can absolutely be your marquee player and be one of the best players at your club to start off. By the time that the Perth Bears, join the comp, he will be 30, which is prime time for a fullback. And if you can get 3 good years out of Will Kennedy for 500,000 a year, 600,000 a year, you are cheering if you are the Perth Bears. So that's probably the main one that I kind of see him doing. But the whole talking point is where he'll be in 2026. Now, if we are to say that he is headed over to the Perth Bears in 2027, that still leaves him without a place to call home next year. So we've got a few options here. One of them was to stay at the Sharks on a smaller wicket, 300,000, 1-year deal, finish off your Sharks career, leading, hoping to lead your side to a premiership alongside Hines and Fanua Blake, and finish off on a high note, and then head over to the Perth Bears, where you'll get a much larger wicket. Now, that was probably the first one that I think most people would kind of agree with. I had a few other options for where he could sign 1-year deals and that includes the Canberra Raiders, the New Zealand Warriors, and the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. So I see him doing a 1-year stint at any of these clubs. Now, to break it down a little bit further for you, I view the Warriors and the Raiders in similar positions when it comes to signing Kennedy. I think both clubs have serviceable fullbacks, potentially even better fullbacks. I see Chevy Stewart as the fullback of the future for the Raiders, and I do see Tang Tuapiki as the fullback of the future for the Warts. However, I don't view either of them as ready to be a fullback of a premiership winning side. I see Will Kennedy as that fullback. And so I think that, both sides, I believe they're both sitting second and third in the NRL right now. I think if you bring in a Will Kennedy as your fullback just for a year to help push for a premiership as you decide to kind of build those guys up, 9 times out of 10, I would do that. Now, most of the backlash I received was from Warriors fans who kind of pointed out that, Charles Nicoll-Klokstad is still at the club and he was just re-signed. Well, I do understand that, and I love Charles Nicoll-Klokstad. I think he's honestly probably one of my favourite, just personalities in the competition. You can tell he's just such a sweet guy, and he really loves his footy. But the Nicoll-Klokstad re-signing was always a little bit weird to me. Not that he's no longer an NRL standard, but he's definitely not what he once was. And I do view Will Kennedy in a slightly better position than Nicoll-Klokstad right now. And so I don't know what you do with Nicoll-Klokstad if you move him into the centres, a 14, in that situation. I really don't know, and I think that's where the biggest hiccup is. But I do see, a 29-year-old Will Kennedy helping lead the charge to a premiership for the Warriors. I think makes a little bit more sense than bringing in a Tuapiki. Now, if you think you can win a premiership with Nicoll-Klokstad, then by all means keep him there. But in my opinion, if you can get a guy like Will Kennedy for 400,000, 500,000 for 1 year, and he's top 5 in daily voting right now, and he's in his absolute prime, a 29-year-old Will Kennedy, I'm doing that if I'm the Warriors. And it's a similar story with the Canberra Raiders. Now, obviously, KO Weeks is doing a great job there, but I don't think his position is fullback. I prefer him in the halves, potentially. Now, Chevy Stewart, I think, is going to be one of the great fullbacks of the game in the next 5 to 10 years, but I don't think he's that yet. And so I think if you bring in a Will Kennedy at fullback, that helps push your side to a premiership win. And I don't think that, I think Ricky Stewart can absolutely get the best out of him, and I don't think that they can win a premiership otherwise unless they've got a superstar or, a fringe star player like Will Kennedy out the back. And so that's where I kind of see the 1 year stint with them. Now, with the Bulldogs, it's a little bit different. Now, when I wrote the piece, there was talk about Connor Tracy potentially going, leaving the Dogs to make room for Burton at fullback. Now, there's been a lot of kind of talk there as to, obviously with Galvin news kind of coming through and, Burton potentially playing 13 or playing 1, Galvin playing 13. Like, there's so many moving parts there. But I do think if you lose Connor Tracy, you slot Will Kennedy in right there for a year. I think you do that, again, 9 times out of 10. Now, Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs, I probably hold to a lesser degree than the Warriors or the Raiders. I do think that the Bulldogs are premiership contenders with or without Will Kennedy, as long as they've got Connor Tracy there. Now, if you don't have Connor Tracy there, then I think you bring in Will Kennedy. If I am the Bulldogs, if you do want to kind of fit them all in, I would potentially bring in Connor Tracy as a winger, or bring him into the centres and move Bronson Xerri out to the wing. And then you bring Will Kennedy in at fullback. So there's definitely room there to do that if you are wanting to. I think for the Bulldogs, it depends on how they finish this year and kind of how this all plays out with Sexton, with Tracy, with Galvin, with Marnie. There's so many moving parts now since the kind of news drop that Galvin will be joining the Dogs earlier this week. And so I feel like that's probably I hold to a lesser regard than the Raiders and the Warriors. Now, my next kind of talking point when it comes to Will Kennedy is potentially bringing him in as the, post-Tedesco retirement plan option. Now, Tedesco's 32, turning 33 next year. And, obviously he's not getting any younger, but he's also not getting any worse. Like, he's still killing it as the fullback for the Roosters. But realistically, I don't see Tedesco playing any longer than 2 to 3 more years, just because he relies so much on his athleticism and his his ability to run the ball hard and kind of just do ridiculous things with the football. And I do think that essentially over the next 2 years that's going to diminish a lot. And so I think if you can bring in Will Kennedy as that post-retirement plan for him, and make that kind of smooth transition into Kennedy as your long-term fullback, at least for the next 5 years. I think you do that if I'm the Roosters. And that's not to say, they don't have, solid fullback options there. But again, you're not going to be paying Kennedy, a huge sum to be your fullback for the, you can put him on a backloaded contract where, the big money kind of kicks in once he, transitions into that fullback role, and then maybe you bring him in as a winger, as a center. That's kind of the route that I would go if you were to bring him in as Tedesco's fullback for the future. And my last kind of option for a Will Kennedy is to head over to the Super League. You'll be 29 next year. You're in the thick of your prime. I think that you can command upwards of $600,000 a year, and you would be potentially the face of the league. You look at a guy like Bevan French, you look at a guy like Matt Duffy, who have gone over there and have absolutely just taken the competition by storm, most notably Bevan French. And so, a lot of the time NRL players head over at the end of their careers and, they're on bigger wickets for their age, and they kind of just fizzle out of rugby league through that kind of route. But if you're Will Kennedy, you can probably get another 6 to 8 years of footy and be commanding 600,000 plus a year. You get to live in Europe, and you get to be the face of a competition that's rapidly growing. And if I'm Kennedy, that's a lot more appealing than probably most people think. And so I definitely think that a Super League switch could potentially be the option for Will Kennedy, and he can kind of nail down, his post rugby league career. You can, make probably double what you would make in the NRL over the next 8 years. And you would, solidify yourself as one of the great Super League players. And so I definitely think that's an option that probably not enough people are crediting enough. But I definitely think that's a really good option for him. So there's a few options there. Me personally, I'd have him head over to, the Perth Bears in 2027, and then just take up a 1 year stint for 2026 at either the Sharks or any of those other clubs I mentioned. those were the three main talking points that I wanted to get through today. Obviously, it's just me talking today, so my voice is a little bit coarse. I'm used to having Les kind of steer the ship for me and carry a lot of the load when it comes to talking, but always love hopping on here and just kind of chatting all things footy. And I guess, those of you who are listening kind of feel the same. And, with so many kind of huge stories going around the NRL at the moment, I think it's really important to get stuck into these lesser known stories, or at least lesser talked about stories. And I think all three of these stories would be, a lot bigger if obviously the whole Galvin kind of news hadn't dropped, and the whole Origin thing as well, happening tonight. I think there's so much going on in NRL media, which is absolutely amazing. And if you're wanting to kind of keep up to date with everything, no hidden agendas, no kind of bias, head over to zerotackle.com.au. Not only myself, but all the guys over there really put in, a lot of work into, providing the best kind of news content without being biased, and adding our own personal twist to it as well, which is, it's much sought after in this whole NRL media realm. So definitely give those guys kind of a read, and have a read of kind of the articles that I've talked about on here, and some of the ones I haven't as well. So head over to Isaac_journalist if you're keen to know more about what I do. My DMs are always open. But other than that, I think we are done for today. So, like I said, Les should be back next week. But I thank you all for kind of sticking around and chatting with me today. And I will chat to you next week.